He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist coming up on 27 years of experience in the business. Together, we're the Brief Brothers. We love to talk about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. We're back for another episode, Henry. Today, we have a return guest, Cameron Day. He's the author of not 1, but 2 books. They are under the title of The Advertising Survival Guide, and this is number 2. Let's join the conversation. Henry, we're back with another episode of the Brief Brothers, and only the second person in our entire history, Cameron Day, is back for a second time. And we got to go on the record and say there's only one reason why he's back for a second time, and that's because he mentioned both Henry and me in his acknowledgments at the very end of the book. If you hadn't done that, Cam, forget it. We wouldn't have brought you on.
A little gratitude goes a long way, Jeff.
Yeah, exactly. And that we were buried amongst all these great names that he had given thanks to at the end of his book. Well, we had him. How long ago did you come onto our show the first time, Cam?
You know, I went back and I was looking at the episodes, and who was I'm so
this year?
I'm so bad with dates. I can tell you that I think Mr. Harrison was shortly after me, and I think Mr. Sullivan was shortly after me.
Okay. Well,
yeah.
our guest today, if you haven't figured it out yet, because I haven't said his name, is Cameron Day. He is a creative talent extraordinaire. He's been everywhere from copywriter all the way up to executive creative director and everything in between. And now he is sharing with us and the world his experience. He's written 2 out of 3 books. They're the Advertising Survival Guide. He was on our show earlier this year, I think, to talk about his first
10 months
book.
ago.
Was it 10 months? Yeah.
Yes.
Wow. 10 months ago, Chew with Your Brain Open, and now with your mind open, excuse me. And today he's here to talk about number 2, Spittin Chiclets. And I hope at some point when number 3 is out, you'll return. I hope it's not 10 months from now, but at some point you'll be back. So
all goes well today, and I behave myself. 3 is already drafted, and we're actually in design with it, which means it's very close. I just want to make sure I gap it properly to where there's enough time for people to get hip to the second book before I drop the 3rd book. Well, but it's a trilogy, and it'll be done, and it's a nice feeling to kind of cap it.
Yes. So with all that, welcome, Cam, back to the Brief Brothers. Henry and I are great to have you.
Thank you.
So, as I was telling you before I hit the record button, my goal, and we've got to admit now here up front, Cam and I had lunch a couple of days ago. We do this regularly. We live just a couple miles down the road from each other here in Austin, Texas. And he gave me some advice. He said, if you want to get through the book quickly, read his chapters are broken into 3 sections. You know, this is an organized writer. We're working here with Cameron Day. And he said, read the 3rd part, which, what do you call the 3rd part? That's the
call it food for thought. It's basically summation of, to me, what are the most important points in each chapter.
Yeah, it's kind of like the highlights of the chapter. So I started to do that, but I got caught up in the actual writing of his book. And I told him before we started recording, the anecdotes and the stories and the information was just so compelling and so well told that I was going too slowly. I did finish the book. I did go all the way through it, but it took me a lot more time than I planned, and I enjoyed myself. So I don't know if I should be pissed at you or be grateful to you. Probably a little bit of both.
I'll take it. If you read the whole thing and we're still talking, that's a good sign.
Now, there are some chapters that obviously struck me more than others. And because Henry and I like to focus on the creative brief, I'm going to return to something that we all talked about when your first visit, which is your penchant and preference for writing what you call mantras.
Yeah.
And you expanded on your first book in this chapter on mantras, which is a way of taking the brief, the creative brief, and rewriting it to your depth of understanding about the brand is where you feel most comfortable. Whether that's 2 sentences or 2 pages, you don't think it doesn't matter to you. But let me just open this book up because I want to talk to you about, the couple of the things that really, they just grab me around the neck.
God, I hope I didn't steal them from somebody else's book.
Well, tips, maybe I've got to get to the right chapter here, but you were pointing out mantras. I love this sentence here. A mantra is about capturing the emotional essence of the brand. And one of the things I've discovered, and when I do my training in my workshops on creative brief writing, is how often marketers struggle trying to describe their brand. They are really intimately familiar with their product. They know what their product is, but they have a real hard time understanding their brand and describing their brand. And I've gotten to the point where I'm saying, this is not their fault. This really isn't, because they haven't had good direction from above.
They often make the mistake of thinking people care.
Okay, expand on that.
Well, I think nobody loves a product more than the client loves their product. But very rarely does the consumer have that association with the product, unless it's Nike or Tom's Shoes or one of that 5% of the brands that
Apple.
Not even 5%, I would say.
Yeah.
It's like half of 1%.
0.5, yeah.
Well, the optimist in me wants to say 2%, and the realist in you, Henry, wants to say 0.5%. But the point is, there are very few brands that are well defined enough to where you're supposed to care about them, right?
Yeah. But hold on, I just want to say, before we get too far down this path, the fact that only 5% or 0.5% to 5% of brands are that important shouldn't dissuade marketers from wanting to do a good job. Like, we all interact with hundreds of brands all the time. And we're fighting for territory in the consumer's mind. It just means we have to recognize that we're fighting for territory and that we're never going to be, occupying that prime of real estate that a Nike has, and that's okay. We don't have to. You just have to occupy more territory and better territory than your competitor in laundry detergent or toothpaste or deodorant.
But if marketers aren't capable of doing it, how are they going to explain to us, the creatives and the account planners and the strategists, what it is that they're asking us to do? So if they're not able to, I work with these marketers whose task is to write a brief, because they don't have a strategist like Henry. These are in-house agencies or in-house marketing departments. Their incapacity when it comes to describing their brand, not their product, their brand means how do they write a brief? And they recognize this. So I ask, is this their fault? Is this senior management's fault? Where does the blame lay? And your description of what this mantra does for you as a creative trying to solve their problems, I think, is so spot on. I'm going to start sharing it, because it's just like, this is the emotional essence.
Yeah.
One other person I encountered in a training said to me, when I said, define the creative brief, he said, it is the emotional translation of the strategy.
Ah, there you go.
Wow. That was really good.
Yeah, that definitely resonates with me. And I think a lot of times for me, I don't always have clients who are terribly sophisticated, but I find if I take a dry communications brief and I look through it and I find something that resonates with me, if there's something that leans into a universal truth, oftentimes I start there and I state that universal truth, and then I start filling in the support points that would demonstrate that the company actually stands for some of these things. And I think for me, it's a way of entertaining myself to absorb the dry brief and try to play it back in something that feels like the client hears and goes, oh my God, that's my story better than I can tell it. Well, 30 years, you can't not learn something. And God knows I couldn't be an architect to save my life, and I certainly couldn't be a car mechanic, although I try.
That's a great proposition or tagline for an agency, is telling your story better than you can tell it.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
I see Howard writing it down.
And well, no, I'm looking through the book. The book that I've defaced. See how much I've defaced your book here, Cam. You've got some great lines here. Again, this is on your chapter called Mantras and Mission Statements. You don't win awards for writing mantras and mission statements, you win clients, which is a great title. But you say here, brand, essence, and purpose combined. This is these words you live by. Your who, what, and why powerfully personified. This is what your mantra is. You say, when I sit down to write a mantra, I stop thinking like a marketer and focus on what it means to be a human being with everyday problems, personal goals, and aspirations. I get and understand why marketers are these brand zealots who love their brands, even if they're not very good at describing the brand. They love the product, they love the category. But they sometimes, too often, get lost in the trees of their benefits and the reasons to believe and their points of differentiation, and forget that there's a human that may or may not want to use this product.
Right. Well, and to my point, that's when I say, hey, the average consumer might not care. They might not give a rip about who you are and what you do. So you better figure out a way to hook them that gets their attention. And usually if you couch it in their world rather than that's so-and-so, we blah, 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 blah. No, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
we were talking about music right before we went on, and when you said hook, I was thinking it's the hook that brings you back, right? Like that's the nature of advertising. Sometimes it doesn't have to be as substantive as what the clients think or as rational. It's the hook that brings you back. It's that little candy coated thing that catches your attention and makes you remember the ad. And that's what Byron Sharp calls mental availability in the buying moment. You're walking down the grocery store shelf and you need to buy a deodorant and you remember the Old Spice commercial and it made you smile. And at that time, it didn't even make you smile in the grocery aisle. It just was kind of there in your brain because at some point you saw it and it made a connection.
Yeah. Hopefully the Old Spice is kind of at eye level. If it's down on the bottom shelf, to forget it.
You know, I heard, and I don't even recall where, that when Old Spice contacted Wyden and Kennedy, the problem they had was they were going to kill the brand and they had a warehouse full of the shit that they wanted to get rid of.
That I hadn't heard, but I will tell you this. In a Facebook group for strategists, someone shared the pitch document, the pitch strategy for Wyden and Kennedy for 2006, and it's a masterpiece. It's brilliant, and you go back and you reconstruct like the advertising that really broke through for Old Spice and brought the brand back wasn't even the first campaign out of the chute for Wyden after they won it. It was the second iteration of the work that was what really struck a chord with audiences. But the brand planning deck, I mean, I have it under lock and key in my computer. Like I refer back to it because it's such a good model of a way to think about a brand. And it's applicable to so many brands, right? Because at that time, it was a brand that a lot of people knew about, but nobody felt good about. And so it was about.
Are you talking about Old Spice, Henry?
Old Spice. What did I say?
Okay. You didn't say a brand. You didn't tell us which one.
I'm talking about Old Spice when Wyden pitched it. So, it's a phenomenal piece of thinking.
Well, Cam, let me back up here. I'm just like, I'm so, you and I talk fairly regularly, and I'm kind of into this whole brief thing, and I just dove into the bushes here and the weeds, and I want to back up and say why I think Henry and I both agree that this is a great second outing for you. Because this is a series of books, there will be 3, that are guides to creatives in the industry on how to manage their careers. Now, the first one was about getting started. This one is about those middle years. And I know others have said this in the reviews that I've seen on Amazon and in comments on LinkedIn. I wish I had had this book or these books when I was starting out. Because I was clueless. And I can think of so many moments in my career, because now my career is over. I'm no longer a working creative. You still are, but I've retired as a working creative for a dozen years now. I've been teaching full time.
By the way, thank you for the plug. I do have availability right now because I had a freelance job evaporate this morning.
Oh, well, so Cam's available. But one of the things that really struck me, on this kind of like this backing off, because I do have some questions that I wanted to comments and we'll talk about some things about the brief, but the things I just completely forgot about in my own experience until I started reading your own experiences. Now, I never ran shops the way you did. I did eventually become a creative director and realized Peter's principle is probably true. It's like I'm more of a worker bee than a manager. I don't think I was a bad manager, but it's like I'm more focusing doing the work.
Yep.
But you cover so much amazing ground here. How to work with a tough boss, how to avoid bad bosses, how to scope out a good agency for the work that they're doing and align your own interests with that agency's work. Talk to us a little bit about those little pointers that we, when we're in the midst of it, we don't see it.
I think that's one of the truths that I've come to realize is I couldn't have written the phase one book in phase one of my career. I couldn't have written the book about the middle of my career in the middle of my career. So much of this is arrived at by unpacking and looking at the way my career has panned out. Many times I took jobs that on paper, everybody said, oh, dust off your shelves. You're about to have a creative run like no other, and I have a drought. Then I go to an agency that's not known for doing good work, and I get into the one show. So it's been so counter to me. The places that were supposed to be great experiences for me often weren't. And the places I bounced to when I was recovering from the experience of not going to the good place and getting the good work, I end up doing career defining work. It's just astounding to me. And I think a lot of it is that I had very good mentorship from my dad. And I was selling about that mentorship for so long. And then I kind of realized, oh my God, I should share some of this with people because it's spared me a lot of pain and suffering. And because I'm a knucklehead, I still walk into lots of rakes. But I think my father kept me from stepping into the big morass.
Yeah, to some extent, what your narrative really reminds me of Stephen Jobs' commencement address at Stanford in just a few years before he died, where he said, "We can't really see the trajectory of our lives until we look back on it."
Right. Right.
That's what I was going to comment on. I think that's one of the cruel things about life is, if you're honest with yourself and you can look in the mirror and look back, you could say, I did this and that was a mistake, or I didn't recognize what was happening at this agency where so-and-so was trying to undermine me and I should have seen it, or, all of these things that you look back on and you say, God, if I could be put back in my 20-year-old body, I could rule the world because I know now a lot more about how things actually operate. And it's just one of the cruel things of life is, and that it's very hard to impart those things. We try to, right? You write a book, we try to tell people, but it's hard for them to absorb it and internalize it and act on it.
It's interesting, Henry, because I didn't want to write a memoir, right? I mean, Neil French can write a memoir, right? There are far more successful people than I. Steve Jobs has a biography, right? The point wasn't to write a memoir. The point was to use my experience to illustrate points and learning lessons I picked up along the way, and maybe save people some of the pain points I experienced.
Yeah, and I think you did a marvelous job at that, Cam.
Yeah.
Well, my mom thinks I did.
Your mom has good taste.
I was going to say, that's the trick, is getting people to accept the advice. Of course, when you write a book, you have a self-selecting audience of people who want to hear the advice, right?
Well, and also, I think you gain more by acknowledging your flaws within the context of stories. This isn't about climbing up a soapbox and talking about the 10 best things I've ever done, right?
It's about those rakes you stepped into.
Oh, right. And those are some of the best stories. Those are some of the best stories of your book, where you talk about, your experience at this agency, your experience at that agency, where you were asked to leave, and then you were able to turn that very sour experience into a higher severance package.
Oh, yeah,
And
yeah,
that
yeah.
sets you up for the next one. I mean, that's another thing that I was reading about, being fired and being laid off. The first 13 years of my career, from 1986 to 1999, I went from Milwaukee to Chicago to LA. And in those 13 years, I was laid off 7 times.
Yeah.
I was fired once.
And we are conditioned to feel shame for being laid off or fired.
I got over that really quickly.
Well,
And-
that's a pontification that I have in a speech that I give to students. I call it 10 pontifications of an ad agency veteran, or old fart in the vernacular. And the 10th one is, you're going to get fired. Like, make
Yeah.
peace
Well,
with that. But I think the thing is that outside of our industry, the stigma of getting fired is so that people don't realize it coming in. So I tell students, listen, you lose a client, you get laid off. New boss comes in, doesn't like the way you look, you're fucking fired. Like, there's so many different ways to die in the advertising business. Just make peace with it and understand it's okay. You're always going to find, if you're good, you're always going to find a way out.
And that's the avenue to a better job somewhere down the line. And you point that out, Cam.
The way I couch it in the book is, if you haven't been fired, you're not trying hard enough.
Yep.
And I truly believe that. Because as a creative, it's your job to create a certain level of discomfort. Right?
Mhm.
And if you play along and you play nicey nice and you do everything that's asked of you and you never do anything more, you could be in the middle of your career and it be over.
Yeah, we talked about that at lunch, Cam. It's now, for me, it's not the creative, it's the teaching.
Yeah.
I have a point of view, and I've realized I'm a strong cup of tea, right?
Yeah.
I do not go gently into that good night. I have a point of view and I teach that point of view, and some marketers want to hear it and others don't.
Yeah.
And they couch their criticism in things that, we don't do things here. We don't do things like that here. He doesn't understand our business. So I get that perspective.
My dad had a quote that I loved. It's better to die on your feet than to live on your knees.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what? I'm living proof that if you take that mindset and you own it, and you own your mistakes. And I'm sure you guys have been reading up on Dan White, and all these people are posting this beautiful stuff about Dan, that he encouraged people to make mistakes. He wanted you to fail. That is the most productive, valuable thing any boss can give you, to have your back and let you make mistakes, or let you dare so greatly that you're going to miss once in a while.
Mm-hmm.
The stuff that misses when you do things like that, advertising people love to start dissing that stuff. But the truth is, at least somebody created an environment where that could happen.
And encouraged it. He wanted you.
I look at the Progressive insurance campaign, right?
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Rick. And I go, okay, intellectually, I believe that's a parody product. It's no better than 10 other products just like it. And they bundle their home and auto, and everybody's telling the same story. These guys come up with a campaign where they're telling people how not to become their parents. And I hang on every damn word, and I love them for it. If I'm working at a job and they have the little, what do they call it? The healthcare fair, and all the people who are providing healthcare to the company show up, and there's a Progressive tent, you know where I'm going.
It's interesting, because the insurance category is one that on paper couldn't be more boring, couldn't be more, like you said, a parody product.
Yeah.
And starting with Geico and then followed by Progressive and Liberty Mutual and the others.
I'm going to back you up to one. The first one in my mind was Mayhem.
Yes.
Allstate. Yeah. I don't know if they actually came out with that before Geico started.
Actually, I'm not sure either.
But that's another brilliant one.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they brought it back.
But the point is, there's not an industry or a category that could potentially be more boring, and they routinely have the best, most entertaining advertising.
Right.
Like, you're watching a football game and you see the new Mayhem spot with him as like the mascot driving through the parking lot, and it's entertaining, and it's certainly, you remember the brand, and they've maintained the consistency of having a campaign, but refreshing it with new executions and sticking with what works. And so you say, look, if Allstate can do it, why can't you do it, Mr. Widget Maker? Like,
Right.
you know,
Right. Well, it's funny because I think sometimes the greatest gift you can have, and Howard, you're probably going to disagree with me on this, when a brand really has nothing to say, and you just need to figure out a way to serve up a parody proposition in an entertaining sense. I think that's what Progressive did with the Dr. Rick campaign. That blows my mind. It took a campaign I essentially don't care about. It took a subject I essentially don't care about. It delivered me a parody message, which is no better than Liberty, which I hate.
Yeah, Liberty is trying too hard to be like Geico.
And there's the irony of it. You don't want to be the second to the party to do that category, right?
well,
Yeah.
I
don't disagree with you, Cam. I'm not as big a fan of the Dr. Rick campaign as you are, but I don't disagree with you, because I often ask people when I do my training, how many of you think you work on a boring brand? And, you know, a fair number raise their hand and say, yeah. And I said, ladies and gentlemen, there's no such thing as a boring brand. There's only boring brand advertising. The more you perceive your brand to be boring, the more I want as a creative to work on it, because I want to make it sexy. I want to make it fun. I want to make it different. And when you have a parody product, the only thing you have is the brand.
Well, that's the whole differentiation versus distinctiveness argument, right? Like, Progressive can't differentiate based on what they're selling, but they can be distinctive based on how they talk about what they're selling.
Exactly.
And I'm going to disagree with Cam. I don't like the Liberty Mutual work, but I could tell you that it's probably effective, because
Wait. Are you talking
Liberty
about
Mutual, the emu that he said?
Well, I don't think any of us like it. I think we both.
I don't like it, but I think it's done a lot for the brand. I think the brand's a lot more recognizable today than it was 5 years ago
I'd agree with that.
because of that campaign.
But
they were a pale second. They were a pale second to Geico.
Oh, absolutely. They're trying to do what Geico did, but smartly. They chose different colors. They chose a different icon, a different animal, a different whatever. And the truth is, I pitched Liberty Mutual, I don't know, 20 years ago. I was working for Hill Holiday at the time, and they were like our neighbors across the street at our headquarters office in Boston. And it was a nowhere brand. I mean, it was a big company, but because of the agents, but as far as a consumer known brand, it was nowhere. And I got to believe that now with this campaign, at least whether people like it or not, and a lot of people may hate it like we do.
We're talking about it today.
Yes.
And last I checked, that's called free advertising.
Right. Well, we almost got in trouble for that. We should tell you the story where one of our episodes was taken off the air because we played a 2-minute, 30-second film for a really brilliant pharmaceutical product, and they challenged us. They said, you don't have the rights to play this. And YouTube took it down. I wrote back and said, excuse me, there's something called fair use doctrine. We're not trying to monetize this. We're trying to teach and use this as an example. And they said, okay. And YouTube said, okay, we see that you've challenged this. We'll present this now to I forget what the company that made the film. They have 10 days to take you to court. And if we hear nothing from them, we'll put the spot back up. Well, guess what? The episode is back on the air.
Yeah.
So I mean, that kind of challenge happens all the time. But it's just, but let me ask you now a bit, you have in your chapter on taglines, you say taglines are the domain of the 20,000-foot thinker. I love that line. So I want to back off and say, it's probably an unfair question to ask you, but I'm going to say, tell me what you think are the 3 most important lessons that you have imparted in this book for people midway through their career, or maybe approaching midway through their career.
Okay. I think one of them is believe in yourself and stand your ground. If you're proud of the work you're doing, Do not get talked out of it. Be true to yourself, even if it costs you your job. Is that 2? Is that 1? I don't even know. Accept the fact that you're in a truly subjective business, and no matter what you do, you're never going to be anybody's pal. So you're not in the business. Look, I don't pride myself on making enemies, but it's never been about how many friends I can make in an agency. It's about whether I can elevate the work within that agency. And if I can leave a cleaner campsite every time I'm at an agency, that's how I judge my progress, not by whether it wins awards, not by how many people are my buddies and want to go drinking with me. I don't go drinking with people. I go home to my wife.
Good idea. Okay, one more. One more good key lesson. Well, I'll give you a hint when I think that you could talk, because I was just referring to that chapter. You say, don't walk away from an opportunity to write a tagline.
Oh, yes.
Expand
Yes.
on that.
I've worked at so many agencies where it's time to play the great let's rewrite the tagline game, and most people run and hide under their desks, right?
Really?
Why is that? Well, because they don't give awards for taglines.
Yeah.
It's not considered very sexy. But if you're really intelligent about it, you go, oh my God, can you imagine if you were the guy who could tell people, hey, you know, the relentless pursuit of luxury that Lexus launched with and had for 10 years before they ruined it?
Relentless pursuit of perfection.
Thank you. The relentless pursuit of perfection.
You just hit Howard right in his midsection, because he worked on that brand and he's always talking about that tagline.
And by the way, Cam, Tom Cordner wrote that line, the art director and chief creative officer.
I have a funny feeling I know where it came from.
Really?
I always thought that it was a reinterpretation of one of the other great taglines that was written 20 years prior to it for Waterford Crystal.
Oh, yes.
Steadfast in a world of wavering standards.
I think there's a little more of a ring to the Lexus line, but yes, I would agree with you. And then you lamented, just as I have many times on our show, what has happened to the Lexus tagline. It became the passionate pursuit of perfection. I'd forgotten about that one. And today,
Experience amazing, isn't it?
Experience amazing. Yeah, it's just awful.
They are in the process of experiencing amazing, because a dear friend of mine and a wonderful writer has just taken a big job at that agency. And I would say, let's talk in a year when we do my 3rd book, because I would not be surprised if that brand turns.
You know what? I'm offline. You're going to tell me her name again. You told me who it was over lunch, and I'm going to reach out to her and see if we can get her to come.
It's Kathy Heppenstollen, and she's truly one of the greatest thinkers I've ever met.
I'm going to see if we can get her to come on the show, because that would be a great conversation.
I want to go back to 2 things you said, Cam. The first one is regarding people running away from writing taglines.
Yeah.
We don't get a lot of opportunity. I work in the Hispanic, so a lot of what we do is usually some sort of interpretation of a tagline. So I was surprised when you said that people run away from the opportunity to write a tagline.
I think oftentimes people think it's, well, first of all, I think agencies make the mistake of telling all the writers, okay, Cameron, you give me 20, Joe, you give me 20. No. Ask me to write mine.
Yeah, exactly.
A mantra that leads right up to that line, so people can go, oh my God, that works nicely, yeah. Right?
But I was gonna say that to me it's surprising, because you're right. A tagline is something that's usually a lot more durable than any ad, right? Like it's gonna survive several iterations. Ideally, when the client, and it's what we just talked about, when you hit on a good tagline, that tagline should be there somehow in perpetuity for the brand, because if it worked for your brand when it was growing and becoming established, it should be able to flex and be reimagined and reinterpreted and continue to be there moving on. And I was telling this anecdote today, is like, I've been in this business almost 27 years now. And a lot of the work that I've participated in, it comes and goes. It goes on the air and it's gone and it's in the ether, and that's it. And one of the few things that like I see all the time that I worked on was a logo for a funeral home. Because they still have the logo on the funeral home, and it's across from a restaurant that I go to frequently. And it's so a tagline to me is something durable like that. But the other thing I wanted to go back to was your point about kind of, standing your ground. And I'm going to come at it from a little bit of a different approach. And I definitely see the value in that, that advice for people that aren't necessarily inclined to stand their ground, or maybe are a little bit of wilting flowers in the face of adversity. I think for a long time in my career, I erred on the opposite side. I was way too headstrong, way too stubborn, wasn't diplomatic enough about, I knew I was right and I had to be proven right, and they had to do it the way I wanted to. And if they didn't do it the way I wanted to, then they were idiots. And I didn't realize, these are the people that have the power to fucking fire you and put you on the street with your hobo knapsack, and it took a couple of getting beaten down to say, you know what, I find now a lot of value in that. What's that thing about that reflection about give me the power to change the things I can, and the
Alcoholics Anonymous thing, right?
Yeah.
And that's
the wisdom to know the difference.
You need to kind of weigh each situation based on what's really at stake here. And is this the best way I'm going to achieve the outcome that I ultimately want to achieve?
You just triggered, I want to fill in a third thing, and I think it's important. Learn to lose. You are going to lose more than you ever sell. And if you can lose with class and win with grace, you will have a long career.
I agree with that. And I think that's a nice summation of what I was trying to express in many more words that were not coherent. But you're going to run up against adversity, and you're not going to convince everybody all the time that you're right, even if you think you're right.
One of the most mean-spirited bastards I ever worked for hated me. He's the kind of kid that burned bugs with a magnifying glass. and I was one of his bugs. But I'll tell you another thing. He always backed the best idea on the wall, even if I pinned it up there. So I would say that's the kind of boss, even if you're being tortured at the stake, if he acknowledges your thinking and leaves it up on the wall, then he may be an asshole, but he's a pretty damn good boss. He can separate the work from his personal feelings. And that's a very hard thing to do.
You've kind of brought up an interesting topic, I think inadvertently, but I think it's an interesting topic. I have a friend, an acquaintance, who is a Michelin star chef here in Miami. He just won his first Michelin star, and he has a podcast, and it's pretty well followed down here and in culinary circles. And one of the recurring themes of the podcast is how the environment in the kitchen has changed over the last 30, 40 years, where, it was very brutal. Like those Anthony Bourdain Kitchen Confidential days, like the kitchens were like workplaces that were really hostile. And you kind of just, I think, alluded to, I think it's changing in advertising too, just like has changed, and maybe it swung too far in the opposite direction in terms of coddling creatives and so forth. But I do think that a correction was at some point needed, and our industry was just too brutal of an industry.
I totally agree. I had bosses when I was a young writer who'd overtly call me a fucking hack. And to me, I've never responded well to that kind of behavior. It's like, you're going to treat me like that. I'm going to go home on time, and I'm going to put my book out, and I'm going to find somebody who might not be as talented as you, but brings out my talent, rather than just shits on me over and over again and thinks that somehow is going to spark better work.
Well, one of the observations I've made in my career about creatives you know, I'm not a creative, but I work and I have the utmost respect for creatives, is that when you're a creative, you come out of art school or college, whatever it is, and you start working, the first thing you're doing is developing your own personal craft, right? Like you're writing better, getting a good design sense, getting your own style, whatever it is, and you work and so you're an art director, then you become a senior art director, and then at some point somebody gives you the next promotion, and that promotion is like associate creative director or something like that, right? And suddenly none of the stuff that you've learned up till now is worth anything anymore, because now you're directing people, and directing people is a different skill set than being a great art director or a great copywriter.
Nobody trains you in that.
You're absolutely right. And I think that's where I had the advantage of a father who said, okay, now it's time for you to shift gears. You're not competing against these people. You're competing against mediocrity and hoping to find something in their thinking that elevates the brand. Like if you're a working writer, and even as a creative director, I was a working writer, if I'm winning, I'm losing.
And that's why I'd like to go back to your point about the tagline, Cam, because to me, what attracts me to the tagline, and I've written 2 taglines in my life that I'm very proud of, and I was a direct response guy. So it was an unusual thing for me to actually have written a couple of taglines, one of which my mentor / nemesis, Tom Cordner at Team One, actually liked. It was for Air New Zealand. But the tagline to me is a direct path between the creative brief and your deep knowledge of the brand. And if a copywriter or anybody, an art director, doesn't shy away from the opportunity to write a tagline, this is an opportunity to really understand the brand. And when you nail a tagline, as you said in your book, you are saying to the client, and we hope to your bosses at the agency, I get this brand. I get it. Because if you know, when I do this exercise in my workshop to ask marketers to describe their brand, not the product, the brand, I call it the Einstein challenge. You did it when you took my workshop. It's easy to describe the product, but when you have to describe the brand in a way that a kid would understand, the one thing that the ones who get this exercise, they go right to the tagline. If their company has a tagline, and then they realize, well, wait a minute, our company doesn't even have a tagline. Upstairs are trying to figure out what it is. I said, I understand. This is a lot of money left on the table. It's not your fault. But some of the best brands in the industry of all time have taglines. A handful have taglines that have been with them for 40 years.
Yeah.
We had the pleasure of interviewing, I forget his name now. He's from London. He was the creative director on Nike and the creative director with White and Kennedy and the creative director on another major brand. And we asked him about, his name is just escaping me now, but I read his. It's
escaping me, so I'm holding the coffee cup in front of my mouth like I'm drinking.
Yeah. But he said that Nike, everybody knows that Nike's tagline was just do it. And I was under the belief the tagline had stayed the same for 40 years. It didn't. But no one remembers any of the other iterations of the Nike taglines.
One of their prior lines I remember was because there is no finish line.
So that doesn't stick. That doesn't stick in anyone's memory, except a fellow creative.
Somehow stuck in mine, but that doesn't make me right.
Well, but the point is that as we nobody really cares about a brand until you're standing in front of and you're in the aisle and you're standing in front of the product. You have to make a decision, and then it's like, what's the last thing I remember? If I don't have a preference, if I'm not there to buy Tide, right? Because Tide basically owns the laundry detergent aisle. Right. What's the last thing I remember seeing? So again, coming back to the tagline, to me, as someone who teaches brief writing, this is the direct thread from the brief to the deep understanding of the brand. Right. If you have a tagline, if you don't have a tagline, it's a sad state of affairs.
I caught lightning in a bottle once with a brief, and the creative director loved my single-minded proposition, and he abbreviated it slightly and made it into a tagline. It was for the Cleveland Clinic, Florida.
Oh yeah, yep.
Medicine the way it ought to be.
Oh, yeah. Nice.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty rare, but it happens. It happens. Yeah. And I had two. One was for Larson Boats, which was an entry-level runabout, they're 15 to 20-foot boats for inland waterways, not meant for the coasts. They're relatively inexpensive. So my tagline was "Welcome aboard the American Dream."
Oh, nice.
Which they didn't last very long. That's the sad thing about some taglines. And the one for Air New Zealand was, we were introducing to the Los Angeles market the premiums classes, the business and the first class service to Auckland and Sydney, and then to some European destinations. So they were one of the first airlines that had the lie flat beds back in the late 90s.
Yep.
So my tagline was 2 words. It was nonstop comfort.
Oh, nice.
And Tom Cordner said, "That's good." It's like, he also came around my office. I've said this before on our show. He used to come around offices and swear at people, and people would say to me, "If he doesn't swear at you, you don't amount to much." So he came in my office. He came out of my office, and the only thing he would say would be, "How are things in direct marketing?"
Oh, nice. Nice. Well,
Anyway.
I worked for a gentleman named Richie Russo when I was at
I know.
very
I know
early
Rich.
career, and I absolutely loved Richie Russo. And every morning he'd walk by my office, and I mean, this is my first 2-3 years in the business. He would look at me and my partner, and every morning he'd say, "What are you fucking hacks doing?" But he did it with so much
Love.
that we right? Never meant it. It really made us want to go in there.
It's different tongue in cheek than
Yeah.
than somebody who's calling you a hack and,
Yeah,
right.
and with venom.
Yeah. Well, I interviewed Rich for my book on the single-minded proposition. He gave me some great thoughts. So I know who you're talking about.
Yeah,
That's
and he
wonderful.
also had a brother who was a very good writer. I believe John Russo was his name.
Okay, so Cam, back to your book. You had some really wonderful things to say about when you're talking about your mantras, about Apple. I mean, Apple is an icon that we all admire and we have learned great lessons from. And you said, go back and watch that 1-minute spot for what was it with it starts with Albert Einstein.
The crazy ones.
The ones they call it the crazy ones.
Here's to the crazy, and it was
Here's the crazy ones, narrated by Steve Jobs. What an amazingly concise and simple description of their brand.
Yeah.
Wasn't it Richard Dreyfuss?
Actually, Richard Dreyfuss was the voiceover on it, but when they sold it into Steve Jobs, the recommendation was that Steve would do the actual VO, and he actually laid it down against the film, but they decided to go with Richard Dreyfuss.
Okay. Well, you said Google it, and I haven't looked at it in such a long time that I did it.
If you Google it, it shows up with quote marks around it and with Steve Jobs' signature on it. But it was really written primarily by Rob Siltonen.
Okay. So that chapter, I think, because Henry and I have this love and this passion about, creative briefs, I think that chapter stands out for me as a great teaching chapter. And like I said, I'm going to steal a lot of good stuff from that for my training. And Henry and I may end up talking about some other things about it. You've clearly come across some probably mostly dry briefs, but the occasional really good brief.
Yeah.
Do you have a recollection? Can you remember a really good brief in your 30 some odd year career?
I worked on a cruise line last year for Republic of Havas, right?
Yep.
That's your neck of the woods.
Yes, they're neighbors down the street. They're like 5 minutes from where I am right now.
They had a cruise line called Azamara. And Azamara has smaller ships, and those ships stop in the big tourist attraction ports, but they also stop in smaller ports, which gives you a little bit more sense of how a country really lives, right? And what I found interesting is they had positioned themselves priorly as a boutique on water. But the situation they were encountering was other small ships, newer ships were delivering that experience better. So the way the brief was written, it's about the land experience. And I thought how interesting for a cruise to not make it about the ship itself, but make it about changing the experience you have. They called it, I believe, immersion cruising, which oftentimes meant you would spend the night in port rather than having to be on the boat by 10 p.m. So
Or
you
5 p.m. in some cases.
so
Yeah.
you could experience a place during normal working hours, but you could also feel like what it's like at night when the locals are out at dinner, and you could go get a home cooked meal in somebody's home, right? It was a terrific brief because it went against so much of what I associated the cruise experience. So I wrote a mantra for that. And the tagline I wrote that I was very proud of, and it's a pun, was change the way you see.
I remember that. Yes.
And look, that tagline's only been attached to the brand for a year. I hope they hold on to that line for a long time, because it absolutely draws a line in the sand and says, we're comfortable. We serve good foods. You can get a cocktail on the ship, but it's really about being the tourism experience. It's about what happens on the land. In the same way that the Land Rover brief, when I was at GSD&M, was about being a citizen of the world, belonging to a larger community than just the world you lived in. By having a Land Rover, you were connected to everywhere where Land Rovers were. And that was also a fabulous piece of positioning. And it also allowed us to find places to go that the brand had never been.
I think
Gutsy.
I think the cruise line, the example really intrigues me for a couple of reasons. Number one, I worked in the category in 2000 to 2003. I worked on Royal Caribbean Cruise Lines, and that was when the whole nature of cruising was starting to change. The boats were getting much bigger. They were becoming basically theme parks.
Yeah, I don't need a go-kart track.
Yeah, but so neither do I. But I could see, like, at the time and for that brand and what they were doing, it was definitely something new, and it was attracting a different breed of traveler to that brand. And I'm not saying that that's right and this is wrong. I think that this is really interesting, an interesting positioning for a cruise brand, because it speaks to a different mindset, right? Like, it speaks to, to me, like, one of the big advantages that I always felt about, like, cruising, particularly like if you were cruising in Europe, and I recognizing that a lot of people say cruising is not for me, but one of the advantages, like, you cruise in the Mediterranean, is that you get to see maybe 4 or 5 different countries on one trip, and you get to sample them, right? Without making a huge investment in any one country, you get to sample them. And for a lot of people, it might be the only time they ever get to go to Europe in their life.
Sure.
So seeing 4 or 5 countries is better than spending a week in Rome, right? It could be, right? So I like this because it kind of appeals to that idea of that you get to sample culture, right? Understanding there's limitations of cruise lines, but we're going to kind of extend it beyond what the typical cruise offering. And it kind of goes back to that argument, or not argue, it is an argument between distinctiveness and differentiation. Here, there's some degree of differentiation, but the advertising also gives it an opportunity to create the idea that it's even more differentiated than it might be, right?
I'll tell you what, it was the mantra that led up to that line that sold the idea. Because I think the client realized, my God, he ticked off all the points of the brief, but did it in a way that felt poetic, expressed it in a way I'd never heard it expressed before. And then landing on a pun, I thought, what a trick that is, because nobody writes a pun for a tagline. But change the way
puns. I mean, puns are so 80s.
So it's change the way you see SEA.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And Kevin and I have talked about this. I've seen it in context. It really works. It's really smart. Well, Cam, you said you've walked into 1 or 2 rakes in your career, not the big ones, just the little ones. And you've had some great advice on how to avoid the big ones. And I think you've laid out some great advice in this one. Can you give us a little sneak peek on what's coming up in number 3?
Well, number 3 is really, I call it the high altitude point of your career. It's when you fully graduate to the point where it's your job to be a parent who sits on the bleachers and and helps your kids succeed, right? If you can't draw satisfaction from that, don't become a creative director, don't become an ECD. You have to judge your success by how much success you're creating beneath you, right? And that's a very tricky thing to do. To Henry's point is, you start the business and you're taught to be highly competitive against everybody, right? And then as you become a manager, you have to learn to share your toys. And then as you become a real leader, you have to share everything with people that can make them better, knowing half of them won't give you credit for it. But the ones who do, that all it takes is for somebody to go, you know, when you saw this idea and you suggested we do that, that made all the difference in the world.
You know,
it's not getting your name on it in the award books. It's about the acknowledgement that you were able to take somebody else's nugget and polish it just a little bit and go, now go play with it. That's the greatest feeling in the world, is not concerned.
I've worked with a lot of creative directors, and you know, one of the ones that I admire most that I've worked with from the beginning, he was a teacher. He was a guy who taught and teaches at the ad school, but beyond that, a lot of people teach at the ad school, but he always like really had this learning environment in his department. Like the juniors that he would be assigned would always become superstars. Like they would always become superstars. And at one point we were bursting at the seams in the building we were in, on the floor that we were on. And so we had to lease some space, like upstairs, like on the 11th floor, like overflow space. And him and his team got sent upstairs. And it was funny because at one point I said to somebody, I said, you know, he's running a different agency up there, right? and the guy's like, look at me, he's like, yeah. And I said, and you know what? They're better than us. Like that.
Yep.
Yeah, I can recall once in my career, more than once, but one in particular, I got laid off from DDB in LA because we lost a major account. But the work I had been doing was so good that my boss, who laid me off, submitted the work for an award show, and it won something. I forget what it was. And she made sure that my name was attached to the work and let me know. So when the actual award show happened, it was a local award show, she invited me, even though she had let me go.
That is a great story. And I think the greatest thing you can do if you have to let an employee go, whether it's firing, I mean, sometimes people get fired because if the agency culture is like, well, do they fit in with us? I have a problem with that thinking. I don't hire people to fit in. I hire people to stand out.
Yeah.
And I've had a lot of success hiring people who seemed like unlikely candidates and just became rock stars because all they needed was somebody to believe in them and support them and have their back. And then all of a sudden they blossom. And they're the people that always end up having the account people ask to have them on an assignment.
Right.
Because they just get it. They're smart. They don't fight. So I'm a firm believer in finding the misfit toys and treating them like gold. And boy, when you do that, you win a fan for life.
Well, Cameron Day, Henry and I are committed fans of you, and we appreciate your coming on. This are his two books, Chew with Your Mind Open, which is #1 on the Advertising Survival Guide, and 2, which is, when did this one come out? When did #2 come out?
September 1st.
September 1st, Spittin Chiclets, and #3 will come out soon. And when that happens, Cam, we'll have you back on. So thank you for joining us.
Let's not pretend I'm not the only good author out there.
Thank you, Cam. I appreciate that.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much. We appreciate it. Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach. And together we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time, bye-bye.